I'm Lucy Kennedy and I'm a Senior Officer at the Customs and Immigration Division. The division is the authority that implements sanctions in the island, providing guidance and updates to the sanctions lists, administering sanctions licensing and enforcing any breaches of sanctions law.
Hi, I'm Ashley White and I'm Head of AML CFT, the Financial Services Authority. The FSA is responsible for supervising firms in relation to compliance with anti-money laundering, countering the financing of terrorism, and countering the financing of proliferation requirements. In order to help firms meet their obligations, we produce different forms of outreach, including written guidance and videos such as this proliferation series.
Hello, I'm Alexander Sapanov, Senior Inspector at the Gambling Supervision Commission. The GSC, among other things, both license and regulate all land-based gambling operators such as casino, amusement and slot machines, betting offices and lotteries, and the online gambling activities. The GSC, like the FSA, supervise operators for AML, CFT and CPF purposes.
In this video, we are going to explain what the terms proliferation and proliferation financing mean, how international obligations apply to the island, and what regulated businesses need to do to mitigate the risks of exposure to these activities. You may have heard the term proliferation before, but what does it mean? There is no universally accepted definition of proliferation, but the United Nations Security Council Resolution of 1540 provides a useful starting point. Essentially, proliferation is the involvement in the development and use of chemical, biological, radiological or nuclear weapons in contravention of international obligations or domestic laws. The Security Council resolution widens the scope of the types of goods and technology that are to be considered when thinking about weapons of mass destruction. It includes goods which can deliver these weapons, such as missiles and rockets. It also includes goods and technologies that could be used in the development of such weapons. These are more commonly known as dual-use goods. Proliferation financing, or PF, is defined by FATF as the act of providing funds or financial services used for proliferation, which contravenes international obligations or domestic laws. The term funds does not just refer to cash and other monetary instruments. It also includes economic resources such as property, jewellery, and other assets that could be used to obtain funds, goods or services. The Isle of Man is not a UN member state in its own right, but is included within the United Kingdom's membership. UN obligations are therefore applicable to the island, including the Security Council resolutions. The main resolutions that relate to proliferation and PF are 1540, 1718 and 2231. Resolution 1540 requires UN members to impose domestic laws and controls to prevent proliferation and PF by non-state actors. This includes export and trade controls on items that may be used for proliferation. Resolution 1718 relates to measures against the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. That resolution, along with later resolutions adopted in relation to the DPRK, requires UN members to impose restrictions on the export of various goods, services and technologies to the DPRK. It also requires members to implement targeted financial sanctions and travel bans on persons named by the UN and impose transport-related sanctions, especially in relation to shipping. Resolution 2231 concerns measures against Iran, many of which have now expired under the UN obligation, but have been retained in domestic law. The measures include import and export bans on certain goods, including nuclear goods, targeted financial sanctions, and bans on the provision of certain shipping and aircraft services. Along with the UN obligations that apply to the island are certain international standards. The main standards concerned with proliferation and PF are the FATF standards that comprise a series of recommendations. The Isle of Man is evaluated on how compliant and effective its AML, CFT, CPF systems are through a mutual evaluation conducted by the regional body Moneyval. Recommendation 1 requires countries to identify, assess and understand the PF risks in its jurisdiction. It also requires regulated businesses to conduct their own PF risk assessment. However, it's worth pointing out here that the PF risks under this recommendation are limited to the potential breach, non-implementation or evasion of the targeted financial sanctions in relation to the DPRK and Iran. So for the purposes of the FATF standards, this does not include other proliferation risks, such as the movement of goods that are included in the UN obligations. Recommendation 7 focuses on the targeted financial sanctions imposed by the UN Security Council resolutions concerning the DPRK and Iran. All UN members are required to implement domestic law to ensure that asset freezes are imposed on persons and entities designated by the UN Security Council. This recommendation places requirements on regulated businesses to report any assets frozen, any attempted transactions, or suspicious activity in relation to these asset freezes. Obligations are also imposed on the regulators by this recommendation, including the monitoring of regulated businesses to ensure compliance with the targeted financial sanctions. In order to give legal effect to the international obligations and standards, we have to have Manx law. There are a number of measures in Manx law that do this. The targeted financial sanctions required by the UN are implemented by the Sanctions Act 2024. As you may already be aware, the Isle of Man's sanctions framework aligns to that of the United Kingdom. The Sanctions Act gives legal effect in the Isle of Man to the UK sanctions regimes concerning the countries of the DPRK and Iran, and also a thematic regime concerning chemical weapons. The control on the import and export of goods and the provision of services and technology is also in part legislated under the Sanctions Act. In addition, there are further controls on the export of certain strategic goods and dual-use goods. Further information on these controls can be found on the Sanctions and Export Control webpage. The FATF requirements imposed on regulated businesses are given legal effect in the island by the AML CFT Codes, which are produced by the Financial Services Authority and the Gambling Supervision Commission. These codes clarify that PF is included in the definition of AML CFT. The codes require your business procedures and controls to make reference to PF, that any risk-based approach must consider PF risks posed to the business, and that staff training must cover PF as well as money laundering and terrorist financing. I'll now hand over to Ashley, who will explain more about the codes.
Thank you, Lucy. So myself and Alex are now going to cover some additional parts of the codes, including compliance and reporting and the risk-based approach. Before we get into detail, just to provide an overview in relation to proliferation and proliferation financing and what you need to do to reduce proliferation or PF risks in your business. As part of your organisation's risk assessments, you will need to ensure that sanctions risks are included. Alex will explain this in more detail. If you do trade in goods or related services, you must have processes in place to verify what the goods are, where they are going, and whether the customer is legitimate. When it comes to financial transactions, ensure you have processes in place to screen people against the UK Sanctions List and have appropriate due diligence checks in place in line with the codes. You should also ensure any screening software includes the PF sanctions regimes. And as long as your software includes the UK Sanctions List, this will cover these regimes. Review your sanctions procedures so you know what to do if you have a match or other suspicion. Also, ensure appropriate staff receive relevant sanctions training so they understand what the other regimes are, how to find sanctions information, and what the sanctions procedures are in your organisation. This will be covered in more detail shortly. This slide covers reporting and registers. Reporting will be covered in more detail in a video to be delivered by the Financial Intelligence Unit as part of this PF series. But I'm just going to mention the fact that both codes require reporting procedures to be in place within supervised entities. The relevant code paragraphs set out what these procedures must include. But just to emphasise, these procedures must set out details of reporting in relation to potential identified instances of money laundering, terrorist financing, and financing of proliferation. It is also necessary to maintain the required registers by the Code, which include a register of internal disclosures, external disclosures, and any other disclosures made to the FIU, as well as a register of inquiries made to the firm by a competent authority regarding ML, TF, or PF. The Code set out what should be included within these registers in more detail. An essential area to focus on when considering PF is staff training. The codes require that education and training is delivered at least annually for all officers, any persons involved in its senior management, and all employees and workers. This training must cover ML, TF and PF. It must be ensured staff have knowledge and understanding of PF, including learning about how they might recognise PF activities and also an understanding of the relevant sanctions regimes in place. Supervised entities should also consider which staff members might require a more in-depth knowledge of PF. For instance, those staff members monitoring customer activities, those involved in screening, and also the MLRO. In conclusion, delivery of PF training is integral to managing PF risks posed to the firm and is a requirement of the Code. A training register should also be kept so a firm can evidence and demonstrate what training they have done with staff in this important area. Further detail on training, including good and poor practice, will be provided in a separate video within this series. Earlier this year, both regulators conducted a survey to supervise firms to understand more about awareness of PF within industry. Detailed reports were published, which included the findings from these reports. As I mentioned previously, there'll be a further video as part of this series which will provide further insights into these findings and highlight good and poor practice in several areas. But we would like to take this opportunity to remind firms to review these reports, conduct a gap analysis against your procedures, controls and practices within your own firm to see whether any improvements can be made to ultimately improve compliance. Finally, it is essential that firms horizon scan and monitor the global landscape, as well as local requirements for any developments in this area, as well as keeping an eye out for any typologies that may emerge. I will now hand over to Alex, who will be talking through the codes in relation to the risk-based approach.
Thank you, Ashley. So, what do you need to reduce proliferation or proliferation financing risks in your business? In short, this is the utilization of risk-based approach. This approach recognises there are finite resources available to combat PF as well as ML and TF. Therefore, utilising this methodology enables for concentration of the available resources to be applied to the appropriate risks. Risk-based approach requires for a number of factors to be considered, which I will cover shortly, but it is important that you utilise the available data and information you have to assist with this. You, as the business, will have a better understanding of the risks posed, and this information must drive your risk-based approach. Use your data. If you're starting a business, you may not have the available data yet. However, you will know your business, the model you're utilising, and the approach you're undertaking. Use this and the available information to you to help you form risk-based approach. Helpful guidance issued by Customs and Immigration titled Proliferation Financing Risks Guidance includes details of potential risks to businesses in the Isle of Man from proliferation and proliferation financing, which is a great starting point. So, what forms part of your risk-based approach? I will cover the main sections relevant to today's video. However, please ensure consideration is made to the full set of requirements applicable to your business. Business risk assessment. The business risk assessment must estimate the risk of PF, ML, FT posed by your business and customers and must have regard to other risk assessments, which I will go over shortly. PF risks do not need to be separated in the business risk assessment and therefore would need to be included in the financing of terrorism risks. For example, you may only be doing business within the Isle of Man biosphere, in which case consideration must still be made to the risks. However, it may be determined that these are low risks and therefore a decision may be made to combine these. You must record this in your business risk assessment, both the risks and the decision-making process. Ultimately, you know your business best, and in cases where PF risks are deemed to be material, consideration to splitting this as a separate section within the business risk assessment should be made. It is generally good practice to split the PF risks in the business risk assessment, we will be issuing another video in relation to the surveys conducted by the regulators which cover this point. Your business risk assessment must consider the national risk assessment. There is already a standalone proliferation financing risk assessment underway, which will feed into the national risk assessment. When conducting, reviewing, updating your business risk assessment, you must consider the relevant sections of those risk assessments. Customer risk assessment. The customer risk assessment, which estimates the risk of PF, must, among other things, consider the nature, scale, complexity, and location of the customer's activities, as well as the manner in which the products and services are provided. Customers who reside or are located in List A jurisdictions, this being the list maintained by the Department of Home Affairs, automatically pose a higher risk for PF as well as AML NFT. Likewise, customers who are subject to a warning in relation to AML CFT issued by a competent authority or equivalent authority in another jurisdiction pose a higher risk. Where customer poses higher risk, enhanced due diligence must be undertaken, this being applicable to politically exposed persons who pose higher risk for MLFT purposes. Please be mindful that additional requirements apply specifically for foreign PEPs and domestic PEPs who have been identified as posing higher risk. Technology risk assessment. Among other things, the technology risk assessment must consider the relevant risk factors of the business risk assessment. In practice, technology risk assessments and business risk assessments feed into each other. Where a technology is utilized, consideration needs to be made to PF and the already identified risks. When conducting the technology risk assessment, you could consider how the technology is going to be used. What is the purpose of it? Where was it sourced from? Will it be distributed, shared? What risks are associated for PF, ML, FT with the utilization of this technology? You may find that after conducting the technology risk assessment, the newly identified risks require for BRA to be updated, hence the feedback loop between the two. As an example, screening systems, which the technology risk assessment must have regard to, for PF purposes, screening systems may assist with identification of sanctioned or politically exposed persons, feeding into your customer risk assessment, this being another, albeit indirect, feedback loop. However, the screening systems should help with certain identified PF risks. Ongoing monitoring. A review of information and documents to ensure these are up to date, accurate and appropriate must be undertaken, especially where the transaction or relationship poses a high risk for PF, ML, NFT. You must apply and consider the information known to you about the customer's business and risk profile. This effectively means consideration needs to be made to the whole picture, not just the business being conducted. For example, has the customer provided you with a bank statement demonstrating that transactions have occurred with a proliferation-friendly jurisdiction? Or maybe they went into a List A country. Maybe you are already aware that they work for a charity in that region. Or maybe there are other factors known to you that either address or increase the risk. These are just some of the relevant points to consider during the risk-based approach you're undertaking. And whilst today we spoke about PF, this approach should assist you and your business with other requirements. So just to conclude, both codes, FSAs and GSCs, include consideration of PF throughout. Supervised firms must have procedures and controls in place which are tailored to your business and identify and mitigate any identified PF, ML, TF risks. PF must be considered in the risk-based approach. Customer due diligence, ongoing monitoring, which includes customer screening, enhanced customer due diligence, compliance, record keeping, and training. You need to ensure where procedures and controls are required by the code, they take into account PF. Where procedures and controls are updated, you must ensure any additional training needs are considered accordingly. Here on the screen are some helpful links which are in the description, and we will be issuing slides separately enabling for these to be accessed. Thank you for listening and keep an eye out for future videos which we hope you'll find useful.